Next session is about collaboration across services, across institutions, and of course across EU borders. We will start with a presentation by Johan Linåker. How was that? That was Johan Linåker. That's in Swedish. He's a senior researcher at the Research Institute in Sweden, and he will give us his avant-premiere presentation of his soon-to-be-published study on OSS capabilities in public sector organizations in the EU, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. I won't say your last name again. Johan, the floor is yours. You should have a clicker on the podium. Linåker.
That's great, thanks. One of the more better pronunciations I've heard in a long time. Okay, so I prepared 2 times 45 minutes lecture here, so I hope everyone is prepared. No. So I was supposed to give 20 minutes, we're 15 minutes late, so I'm doing 5 minutes compressed, or no. Okay, so as many of you know, we've been collaborating on software development. We've been sharing and reusing each other's code bases in the open now for quite some time, way before any definitions was coined. And looking at society at large, we've come quite far. But looking at the public sector, which we are focused here today, we are lagging behind. We've seen numerous of examples, and we'll see them today, and we've seen them in the past 15 years through OSOR. A lot of good examples on migration efforts, collaborative development, nationally cross-border, procurement, policy initiatives. A lot of them were very successful, but a lot of them have been and are still today very fragile in terms of sustainability. Just as the many open source projects we depend on today in our everyday lives. Why is this? So one of the main challenges, and that has been highlighted throughout today, is the limited knowledge within the public sector in terms of both what open source is, but also how it can be leveraged as an instrument in achieving your policy goals and your digital transformation, independent on what level. For example, in procurement, which we have stressed a number of times. And then another point we touched as well, and this is a very general point for open source all over, not just in public sector, it's culture. If we look in the public sector, we have a very high level of conservatism, of risk averseness, a preference of keeping the status quo, using what we trust, what's already there, the brands and the people we know. And there's also this fear of going outside of your bubble, interacting, collaborating, gaining feedback from people outside of your organization on what you actually do. And then we also have resources. In Sweden, we have 290 municipalities. The smallest one has about 2,000 people. The largest one has about 1 million. You can't expect a municipality of 2,000 people to have the resources or capabilities to leverage or understand what open source is. A procurement officer, they need to procure gravel, hand sanitizers, and software. They will go and look into the catalog and see, okay, what kind of software is there? What are we using? What is the neighboring municipality using? If we look into the private sector in industry when addressing challenges like these, one of the best practices since the beginning of the 2000s is the establishment of what is called open source program offices. These can be described as centers of competency and excellence. They help to support, accelerate open source consumption, collaboration, development, and improve and mature the organizational readiness. They help to design, facilitate, and execute on the open source strategy of the organization so that open source can be used in alignment with the business or policy goals. If we just forget about the label open source program offices and just look at the actual support function here, we have seen a number of different centers of competency come and go through the years, again highlighting the sustainability aspects here, how these centers come and go with the policies that they came with. But something is changing now, at least that's my impression. Now we are seeing these centers being created both vertically and horizontally within the public sector on the international and national levels. And what's more is that they are starting to interconnect, they are starting to collaborate, sustaining themselves much as an ecosystem or a community works. But how are these OSPOs structured and organized? So we did a study where we looked at 16 different cases on different levels, trying to find these archetypes for others to learn from, for others to imitate and copy, so we can enable and create this ecosystem and really address the different challenges that we have discussed until now. So one of the first archetypes is the national government OSPOs. These are typically hosted on the national administration or ministries with responsibility for digital government or transformation, be it in general or in a specific area, such as cybersecurity or public employment. Their main goal here is to build and scale the capabilities and possibilities of collaborating and adopting open source throughout the public sector or within the domain. So here we look specifically at France, Italy, Germany, and Luxembourg. But I thought we'd do a deep dive here to provide you some context and look specifically at the case of Italy. So they've had a law for quite some time now, since 2012, I believe, requiring the public entities consider open source firsthand and that publicly funded developed software is released as open source. However, this law and policy has remained quite ineffective as to reports and interviews. It wasn't really until what we label here as the OSPO Developers Italia, or Team Digitale, was initiated in 2017 between the Department of Digital Transformation, Agency for Digital Italy, and when they actually started developing procurement guidelines released in 2019, okay, you have to consider open source. But what if you don't know how? You want to get the requirement into the contract, but what if you don't know what that requirement means? And what if the vendors don't understand what that means? So Developers Italia here have really done an effort in creating guidelines, doing so active support, creating a discoverability platform to find open source projects used and enable their reuse. And what I think is very important here is that they go outside and create this ecosystem or community of communities within the public sector and across the sectors, enabling practitioners, policymakers, hackers to interact, to share knowledge, to engage, to create new communities, to create new projects, engage in existing projects, and so on. If we continue and look at the more institution-centric or organization-centric OSPOs, these are typically hosted within the Department for IT Provisioning Services, within the overarching institution or organization. Their primary goal is more organizational focused, much like industry OSPOs, focusing on scaling and building an internal capacity in terms of adopting and benefiting from open source. Here we look specifically at the European Commission's OSPO, the French Public Employment Service, and the Dutch Tax and Customs Administration. If we look specifically at the European Commission's OSPO, it's situated in the Directorate General for Digital Services, DIGIT, and came as a consequence of the 2020 open source strategy, which they are also set to help facilitate its renewal and execute on. They provide a liaison and an interface enabling the internal interoperability. We've talked a lot about interoperability, which seems fair. And I think it was Francesca who talked about the cultural interoperability, the organizational interoperability, and all of this. That concerns both internally and externally. And this is a very important work or purpose of the OSPO. And also connecting them to the external. And looking specifically at the European Commission's OSPO, one way in how they are leveraging this is through the European OSPO network, where they identify and bring on public sector OSPOs throughout Europe, helping them to benefit, share knowledge, share each other's challenges, and progress and evolve. But also internally looking, they're also doing a much like the industry OSPOs, where they are aiming or facilitating, promoting, supporting the consumption and development contribution collaboration on open source. On one hand, by removing friction for the developers and decision makers, but also ensuring the risk management side so that the decision makers can feel safe and secure, both from the compliance perspective and the security perspective, and that we can trust that what we have in production, but also from the sustainability aspect, that what we use is actually maintained. If we go down to the local level and local governments, these OSPOs are typically, again, hosted within the departments responsible for IT service provisioning or digital innovation policy and so on. Their goal is to enable the use of open source, not for the sake of it, but as an instrument in achieving their policy goals and their own digital transformation on the local level. We'll look specifically at the city of Paris, Bratislava, and Ventspils in Latvia. If we go in and look at the city of Bratislava, what we call an OSPO here is a part of the Department for Digital Services and Innovation, created in 2019. They don't have an explicit open source strategy, as could be expected, but in contrast to, for example, the European Commission's. But they have it highlighted in a lot of different places, such as the Digital Innovation Policy, the Bratislava 2030 policy. Looking at the department where the OSPO is hosted, there is a strong preference for open source due to the local knowledge and culture there. But looking at the city as a whole, there is still somewhat level of conservatism, and there really needs to be a strong business case for whatever open source options you would consider in an acquisition. But this is just good. I mean, you shouldn't just use open source for the sake of it. It needs to create value. And here, the OSPO can help you, provide you with the business case, both from the risk perspective and the plus side. This OSPO is very developer-oriented, as we can see in the other cases as well. They focus a lot on developing, maintaining, providing, hosting open source-based solutions for the city, such as their e-service platform, much similar to Lutece in the city of Paris. They have a very close collaboration with stakeholders throughout the public sector, civil society, and they use metrics quite heavily to guide their development. And looking long-term, they are looking at how they can provide this as a service for other cities and governments across Slovakia. Sticking mostly to the local level, we have the association-based OSPOs, which can be compared a lot to the open source software foundations we have in the community at large and industry. They provide this neutral proxy ground where everyone can come, feel safe, know and trust the standardized governance processes and ways of working. No one can run with it. It's neutral and transparent. These associations are basically have public sector organizations as either members or owners. And their primary goal is to enable their members to initiate, develop, collaborate on open source software-based solutions addressing common needs and goals. Here we looked at OS2 from Denmark, the Dutch Association of Municipalities, and Open Cities from the Czech Republic. If we do a deep dive into the Czech Republic, Open Cities, that's a non-profit consisting of 20+ cities, although they do have regions as members as well, which does expand the number of cities indirectly. They receive and host open source projects initiated by public sector organizations, for example, in contrast to OS2, where the members initiate them themselves directly. At the point of the study, they had 6 projects, one of the more prominent, Cityvisor, an open source tool for visualizing and providing transparency into municipal management, such as public spending. They have a really close collaboration with civic tech, hacker communities, and they are really engaged in the national effort towards creating a national government OSPO within the Czech Republic, but also driving the collaboration and maturity on the European international level through the Brno Declaration. Okay, but then switching to the academic side. These academic OSPOs are typically hosted within the higher education and the scientific research organizations. And they provide support for development and dissemination of research and outputs as open source. We looked at the cases of Trinity College Dublin, Lero in Ireland. And going specifically into Lero, they have a special setup where they have a very informal and very decentralized OSPO with a team of subject matter experts spread across the institution. They support and train the researchers in how they can develop, collaborate, and disseminate their outputs as open source. But they also consider it from the larger, more high-level open science perspective, bringing, for example, open data as a very important tool here. They're also looking at the Trinity College Dublin and how you can start to spin out the research outputs using open source business models as well. And a good thing to note here that it's in this space, it's really happening a lot of things in the United States right now due to different funding programs. So I think there's a lot of things to learn here as well. So going outside of the public sector and academia, we also found an interesting angle here where we have these complementary support functions for the public sector, organizations independent of any ownership or membership from public sector organizations, but they have as a goal to build and support the public sector in growing its open source capabilities and benefiting from it. Here we look specifically at the case of Code for Romania, a civic tech nonprofit from 2016, which has the aim to equip both civil society and public sector in more high-quality public services. For example, within education, healthcare, environment, and social services. They develop, host, and maintain these services for the public sector. Sometimes they transfer it to these organizations as well. They have a very structured process in how to do this and how to identify the critical areas. So, which archetype should you choose? Well, again, it's very dependent on who you are, where you are, and this whole network. But one thing you should definitely start out with doing is look around, look into this room, look into your local area and your own nation. What initiatives are there? Who can you learn from? Who can you interact with? Who can you collaborate with? Who can you join forces with? And one thing we really noted among the cases and the interviews was this need for growing common institutional capabilities here, common capacities, joining forces, pooling resources, pooling knowledge, creating knowledge, addressing common challenges, as the ones we've talked about today. And on a positive note, we also know that with this need that there is a will, especially from the more capable organizations to support those less capable. And here, the association-based OSPOs really provided a great example here, how the larger municipalities, those with stronger budgets and internal development resources, take a lead and drives the development, but also enable those less capable, but still as important actors to join in, contribute, be it financially just or tag along, but also with important inputs on different use cases and so on. And what we also saw here in the last case was this complementary aspect of going outside of the public sector, not just thinking isolated, but there are other parts of society that can help us in this maturity. And this really highlights this importance of growing and bridging our communities and different actors. So this, again, we should go outside of the public sector, include and talk to academia in terms of open science, knowledge transfer, civic tech, civil society at large, but also industry, who are leading the best practice and the development in terms of organizational use and consumption and collaboration, and especially sustainability. And we need to do this both on the international level, so we're talking about, again, interoperability, cross-border collaboration, organizational interoperability, connecting the different public sectors on a nation level, on a city level. down to the national level, getting the different sectors within your country to collaborate, to talk to each other, all the way down to the city level, the local level. So to close and looking forward, the OSPO, as we can note, whatever name, forget about the word OSPO, it's a support function, it's an enabler. It's a change agent, it's a driver of culture, of organizational change. I mean, I don't know how many times now today, and we're only halfway, we've iterated on the word culture, but I mean, makes sense because it's very fundamental. It's not unique for public sector in any way. As soon as you come with the word open, you will be faced with resistance. So we need to consider both the risks, the costs, but also the plus side, and address people's fears and this being uncomfortable. And the OSPO can really help provide you with these tools, introducing the best practices. And we're also talking a lot about policies in terms of procurement. It's not just putting it as a policy, mandating the use. You have to provide the knowledge, the support, the understanding, tooling, infrastructure of how to actually know how to understand the requirement, but also from the vendor perspective. So the OSPO is a policy enabler. You have the policy and you have the enablers with the OSPO, as we saw, for example, in the case of Italy. So this is needed to actually, for us to reach the different policy goals, be it sovereignty, interoperability, or innovation. And what we can note here is that the OSPO will continue to play a pivotal role going forward. Ideally, the OSPO would dissipate with time as we will have a natural transition, as we've seen in a lot of the big tech companies that are down investing on their OSPOs. But that's due to the fact that they are actually undergoing this change, that openness has started to become a natural part of the organization, of how people work. And the term open source here, we need to go on, and that will come gradually and naturally, just to also include open data. We shouldn't just not talk about open data. We need to talk about open data, software, standards, and also silicon, hardware, science, and not to forget OpenAI, which we don't know exactly what is OpenAI. Thanks.
Ooh, I almost made the flowers fall. But it's good you spoke about breaking silos, because your next panel is going to be with many different industries, and for that I'm very glad to invite you, Clare Dillon. You made my life a bit easier with the pronunciation, and you will be pronouncing the names of your panel members, but please join me on stage as I introduce who you are. You're a researcher. No, go ahead. We'll embarrass you a little bit. Also a lady with many hats. You're a researcher at Lero, the Science Foundation of Ireland's Research Centre for Software. You co-founded the Open Ireland Network, which is working to promote open source in Ireland at national level, and you're very much involved in the global communities of inner source and OSPO practitioners. That's one hell of a title, but you will invite your panel members. We're running slightly late, so stretch, but don't stretch too much.
Thank you, Dan.
So you're the last thing between us and lunch.
Oh, no pressure then.
All right, I'll leave you to it.
Thank you, Dan. And Johan, maybe I'll ask you to take a seat here, if you wouldn't mind, in the middle. That would be fantastic. I am delighted, and thank you, by the way, for that wonderful introduction to what OSPOs are all about. And today in our panel session, we're going to be focusing on a little bit about how OSPOs can actually help the collaboration and the interoperability that we've been talking about today. So I'm delighted to invite my wonderful panel here today, each of whom are actually working in either an OSPO or in an organization that carries out OSPO-like functions. As we heard, that's often very common. So without further ado, I'd like to invite on stage, please, Nils Masuch, please, who's from the Federal Ministry of the Interior and Community in Germany. Also joining Nils will be Nejia Lanouar, the CIO from the city of Paris. I'd also like to invite on, well, we have Johan, so thank you for joining us as well and staying back to answer some questions, Johan. Along with Johan, I'd like to invite Georg Kunz, who's from the Open Source Program Office in Ericsson, our industry representative, and indeed Miguel Diez Blanco from the Open Source Program Office in the European Commission. And I'd give everyone a warm welcome here, please. Thank you very much. I'll let you all in. Thank you, Miguel. So I think to get started with, I would love to hear a little bit about your own role, why you started an OSPO or an OSPO-like function, and indeed what needs are fulfilled by it. And I'll start going down the line. Would you like to start, please, Nils?
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Yeah, my name is Nils Masuch. I'm working for the Ministry of the Interior in Germany, more specifically in the department that is taking care about aspects and initiatives with respect to digital sovereignty. And when you think about Germany, back in 2019, we conducted a market study which really revealed that there is quite a high degree of dependencies to different technology providers within Germany and within the public administration. And based on that, on the highest IT council in Germany, there was a hybrid strategy that has been evolved out of that. On the one hand side, we decided to further have deeper negotiations, of course, with hyperscalers, IT service providers, to come up with better conditions to address our pain points. But on the other hand, in 2020, it was decided and we received the mandate to really focus on alternative open source solutions, to come up with alternatives that really are long-lasting, that are scalable, and that are really suitable to the aspects and requirements of the public administrations. So based on this mandate, we started several initiatives. One of them was like a very practical initiative from first hand. It was a platform which we call Open Code. It's an open source platform for the whole public administration where we really tried to address the aspect of transparency and visibility. Because, I mean, Germany is a very federal state consisting of federal states and municipalities. And often we are not aware what we do have as solutions within Germany. So that was our quick win. We tried to come up with a platform that fosters this transparency. Second, it was revealed that we have explicitly a pain point when it comes to applications with respect to the daily work of public administration employees. So if you think about word processing, if you think of file sharing, if you think of video conferencing, it was quite obvious that we need to find and work on alternatives on that. So we started out of the ministry directly an initiative which we call Sovereign Workplace. Open Desk is now the short word for it. And this was a second concrete path we drove forward. And third, we decided that we really need an agile institution that addresses this on the long term. We are pretty aware that this is not possible out of the ministry in the long run, so that we need an institution that has the power, has also the employees. So we decided to have, to reach an employee size for the Center for Digital Sovereignty, as it's named, for about 65 to 70 employees in its final stage. So, and this is something that we drove forward like the last couple of years, and the Center for Digital Sovereignty has been founded then by the end of 2022. And then it now took quite some time to go through all the further administrative processes, but now we are in the stage that we are currently setting it up, getting employees and getting it really running. And the first step will be to hand over these initiatives that I just mentioned beforehand. And just in a nutshell, the main task of CENES, as we see it, is to be an institution not only for the federal level, but also for the federal states, for the municipalities, to provide know-how and also to be the linkage, or the interconnector between public administration and the open source ecosystem.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you for, you know, even from the get-go, this idea of the OSPO or this centre is the link between public sector and helping that collaboration happen. So thank you for sharing that. Nejia, would you like to give us the overview of the city of Paris and their OSPO?
Thank you. So in City of Paris, we have been launched an open source policy for maybe 20 years. It needed a strong political will, and it was after a need to offer websites 20 years ago to the citizens in the different arrondissements. And it didn't exist at this time, something off the shelf. And the political team also asked my predecessor to develop it in open source. So it was the first project of City of Paris, and less than 1 year later, the first digital platform in open source code was launched. And the municipal council voted to open the code for the other administrations, believing that what was developed by the public sector had to be shared with the other public entities. So our journey began at this time. And the years after, this political will was strong and supported by all the municipal teams. And we developed this platform. We made it at the state of the art. We're including now artificial intelligence, for example. And we are also using open source or sharing open source or creating open source project in other domains. I will explain it maybe later. But at a point in my department, which is in charge of infrastructure, developing and maintaining applications for the digital roadmap, cybersecurity, open data, we realized that it was not enough, and it is not only a question to develop open source code and to put it on GitHub or GitLab. We need to really develop an open source program. We need to share, we need to reuse, and we need contributions. And it was something very difficult. So we worked on the idea of an OSPO during a certain time, and our first OSPO was launched in 2021. And we can say today that we have some results. We have more contributions, we have more exchanges with our peers, and probably more possibilities to use and to share and to improve our developments. We work with, for example, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and they helped us to improve our developments. We also had problems of promotion of our Lutes platform, which is our main digital service tool. And so we had to work on this aspect because we are engineers generally, and it's not our first skill. And now we try to package it and to make it easier to adapt and to use technically. And so we can say now that we are ready to be more professional, to produce information and training for the internal teams, and to be professional of open source.
Thank you, and congratulations on both your achievements so far and on the setup of the OSPO, and indeed your examples of collaboration that are already happening, internationally, which is fantastic to see. Johan, I'll come to you next. I don't believe Sweden has a national OSPO per se, but you have been involved and are one of the driving forces behind NOSAT. So, can you maybe describe what that organisation is and perhaps what OSPO-like functions it fulfills within Sweden?
Definitely. Is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. So in Sweden, we don't have a strong national policy, as in France or Italy and so on. We have some recommendations here and there, and we don't have someone with the mandate driving these questions. But we have a lot of engaged people throughout the public sector, within the different public administrations, both on the local, regional, national level. So what we saw in the process of our research project, and when I was very close collaborating with the Public Employment Service, was that there is a need for people to actually convene and discuss and actually share knowledge, exchange practices, develop best practices. And then we started this, let's just do a workshop, and then that escalated to, we have monthly workshops where we learn from each other. We bring people from working with electronic archiving, for example. We bring them together. They talk about open source, and that they can convene a lot of best practice to other areas as well. And we also have this link between data and technology. as you shouldn't just consider open data in isolation, but also the technology around it, because we have a lot of knowledge about open data in Sweden, a lot less about open source software. And there's a lot of knowledge about, yeah, we need to publish the data, but very less about actually what data should we put out there, how can we collaborate on the data, and also the technology around it. So that's where NOSAD came in and really provides a foundation to bring in knowledge. And we try to bring in also international knowledge. So one of the more earlier workshops we had Bastien Guy and Leonardo Favero from Developers Italia, for example, and Rasmus Frey from OS2 to actually come in and discuss and present what they're doing. And that really highlighted a lot of light bulbs across the country, I would say. And now, since then, OS2 has been put out in different conversations as an example for how municipalities can collaborate, how Italy and France are working with discoverability platforms, software forges. That provided the idea of creating our own. So now we have public code or offentligcode.se in Sweden, where we try to list open source used amongst the public sectors. And now we have contributions both from vendors, community, and public sector. And that's just maintained by the community. And so it's about helping, sharing, and developing resources that can help progress us forward. But that's just one piece of the puzzle.
No, thank you so much. And it's an important thing to remember is the power of motivated individuals. Even if you don't have something formal, that there is still a possibility to bring together people with that shared interest to actually get a lot of value that you might otherwise get from a formal OSPO. And speaking of formal OSPOs, so Georg, you've got the experience in the private sector and industry. So can you perhaps maybe explain to us about your OSPO, your role there, and what needs it fulfills for the organization?
Sure, I'd love to. Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Georg Kunz. I'm a program manager in the Ericsson Open Source Program Office, and a little bit like on my background first, maybe actually my background is in software development. So over the past 10 years, I've been an active contributor to various open source projects and communities, and I still am. But internally in the company, I've transitioned in that time basically from being a proper developer to taking on more and more coordinating roles. And finally then I joined the OSPO. Around about 3 years ago, and at that point in time, this was actually when the OSPO was newly created. So we have an OSPO, a formally formed OSPO now for 3 years, and that was done basically due to the clearly understood need that we need to have a properly formed organizational entity in the company that takes care of how we work with open source software. We talked about dedicated individuals driving open source, and we have been using open source software for 10, 15 years and more. And there were, of course, colleagues in the company, and still are, right, who drove this and took on OSPO-like roles. But given the strategic importance that open source has for our product development, it just makes a lot of sense to have a proper organizational entity with the right mandate, the right staffing and competence to drive this, to drive alignment across the company, to help on educational efforts, to set strategies, and all of that. And this is why we established the OSPO 3 years ago. We are a small team, though, just 4 to 5 colleagues, roughly. The OSPO is hosted in the CTO office, so it's a centralized organization. And of course, it's really small compared to the rest of or the size of the overall organization. So of course, like the theme, collaboration, right? We need to collaborate with our peers in the company so that the cultural change, the policies that we define, we can transition them or execute on them in practice. So collaboration is key to make sure that we are successful.
Thank you, Georg. And now I'm going to come to you, Miguel. So we were lucky enough to hear a little bit about the European Commission's OSPO from the case studies that Johan shared, but perhaps you could add a little bit more about your role and from your perspective, in the context of this collaboration theme, what needs does the European Commission OSPOs fulfill?
Hello everyone, and yeah, very happy to be here also. And yeah, actually, I found many similarities with the OSPO at Ericsson because, first of all, we have the same age, 3 years old. So we're speaking about OSOR being 15, we are 3. So in terms of size, we have similar size as well. We are 4 FTEs, so I think we have some similarities there. Our origin was the open source strategy that was published in year 2020. And yeah, we came with this role of making things happen as well. So open source was already present, as in the case of Ericsson many years ago, by having our Linux servers in the data center with Apache on top and many things, right? But there was no glue with all those initiatives. And yeah, so we were born in the year 2020 as a result of the open source strategy. It came with an action plan, this strategy. We have 10 actions. And we were responsible to drive that change, to formalize things and to make it a bit more official. And as Nils was mentioning, we, across these different actions, we have as well our repository of open source projects. It's called Interoperable. And in fact, sometimes we will talk about it later when it comes to collaboration, but we have meetings with opencode.de also to exchange in terms of idea, plans. And yeah, the results are there. We can see in 3 years that we are sharing more internally when before the creation of the OSPO. So we have around more than 1,000 repos in our internal repository. Only 10% of those were open, really programmers, developers who inside the house, only 10% could be seen by others. In 3 years, we have tripled that by applying certain policies in our policies. Of course, that doesn't mean that by the fact that we are now collaborating and reusing everything, but we see some lights of hope by some developers finding answers by looking at the code of others inside the house. And yeah, you have some results there as well. And we were responsible as well for making more agile when someone wants to go open. Well, you know, we are a big organization, we're a bit complex. So going open source, you had to go through certain administrative steps that could be even demotivating for developing teams. Sometimes it could take up to 6 months until you get approval from your management to go open, right? So we were active in that aspect as well by removing certain legal barriers, so it's much more agile for us to go open. And many other things. I think we have limited time, so I will not go into detail, but coming back to the intervention from Johan, I think in our case, our role is more to drive change within the organization, the cultural aspect as well that we can discuss afterwards. Yeah, and still a long way to go. We are already working, as Veronica said, on the next iteration of the strategy. We want to keep the good things from the previous one, but maybe, okay, things that we have learned during this period. And so, yeah, an exciting journey, and yeah, happy to be here.
Well, thank you. Congratulations on your 3rd birthdays, respectively. And I mean, it sounds like for most, in most cases, your OSPOs are a reflection of the needs of your organization, and we're set up to help you professionalize, to enable open source within your organization. But the theme here today, of course, is this idea of collaboration across borders and more broadly than within your organization. So maybe we'll move now to actually have a little bit more of a discussion about the role that your OSPOs do and can actually fulfill in that respect. So I'll start with you, Nils. Just in terms of the German Center for Digital Sovereignty, which I believe is Zendis, right? We can shorten it now to Zendis from here on in. So so it's fascinating to hear about Zendis and its goal and what you've achieved so far. But how are you planning to work with other EU countries? And I'm thinking about taking into account the differences in terms of needs, funding, like the tech stack, the language. So how are you considering that in the context of Zendis?
As I mentioned before, Zendis sees itself as an interconnector between public administration and the open source ecosystem. And coming out of that, there are several tasks to fulfill. As already been mentioned, there is the need for consultation. There's the need for support in the identification of needs, sometimes also for the public administrations, but also to really engage a vivid community on the other hand. But one of the tasks of Zendis is also, and it's all written down, to really foster the international cooperation. So it's a clear goal of Zendes to address this aspect. And even before Zendes was built or was founded, we already started interactions on the European level. So when I was talking about this sovereign workplace, OpenDesk, there were discussions with France. There was even a memorandum of understanding written down on the political level with Austria to cooperate on the solution based on open code. So we already started our first seeds on this topic. But I think what also was mentioned in the last panel, we definitely need concrete big examples where we really try to work collaboratively upon. So as I mentioned, this topic of OpenDesk, which is our initial project, we definitely intend to go further into interaction with other countries and really reflect, not just present what we did, but really get into the discussion whether there are needs from other countries also for such a solution, and what are their requirements and how can we cooperate on them. So I think these steps have to be made to really go out and present what we have. So on the first level, we are presenting it internally, of course, so that municipalities are aware of what we're doing, but we definitely need to do it also on the trans-governmental or trans-member states level. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. And then, Nejia, your experience is predominantly from a city perspective. So then thinking about how Paris is paving the way for open source at a city level, what have been the high points of your journey in terms of collaboration?
As I said before, our journey began in 2002. It was a long journey, and maybe I can share with you our principal difficulties, because something were successful and others are now to solve, and that's why we have now an OSPO to help us to better contribute and use open source solution. First, I think that open source and open data, because in City of Paris we have these two objectives. To develop open source, but also to open all the data we can open to the citizens and to the community, to use them, to transform them. And at the beginning, it was a Java platform. Our main open source project is a Java platform, which enabled to develop digital services very quickly with forms and workflows ready to use. It was very, very useful for the digital services of the city, because it was difficult to find something off the shelf adapted to our needs. But we have also other needs. It's not only the digital services that we have to develop. So when we launch a project, I think we can't be to have a too strong will to develop it in open source, because as it was said before, it needs a mindset. Our users want to have their project very quickly operational, and so we always try to compare the two possibilities, open source versus proprietary solutions, with a very precise list of criteria, and sovereignty, independence, maintainability, of course financial aspects. And so we have 60% of our park which is developed on open source tools. It's also very important in the infrastructure domain. For example, we migrate our Oracle databases to open source alternatives. We use Linux, of course. We migrate also our ERM to Alfresco solutions. And when we can, and when it's okay for the needs of the city, we do not hesitate to migrate to open source solutions. But it can't be everything and for every need. Sometimes I assume the fact that we choose proprietary solutions because it exists, it's less expensive, and it's easy to develop. So now we have 60% of the park on open source. We have also other projects developed on open source solutions. And I think it's interesting to try to understand why some projects are easy to share and others are not easy to share. For example, we contribute to a community of digital platform for school students, teachers, and this community works very well. It's a real reusing and sharing and contributing project. We have more than 30 local authorities using it. And I think that what is important is the similarity of the needs. In this domain, the pedagogic domain, the needs are exactly the same. So it works without any effort. Another example is not very standard, is the launching by Geneva, city of Geneva, of a software to manage rare species of trees and plants for botanical gardens. And it's also an example very specific, but which works very well. The name is Botalista, and if you want to use it, you're welcome. And in this case also, the needs are exactly the same because they are professionals of the rare plants and trees, and they are scientists, and they know exactly what they want. And so Geneva, City of Geneva and City of Paris developed together this platform, and now there are about 20 cities which are using it in France and abroad. So we have to think about this because in other domains it's more difficult.
I love that, and thank you so much for sharing that, because this idea that, you know, when you know why you're open sourcing something, it adds a credibility to the entire effort and it makes it easier. So, you know, this idea that we don't necessarily, you know, come at it from an ideological perspective, but from a very practical perspective, I think helps enable those projects to be more successful. So thank you so much for sharing that. So Johan, then coming to you, thinking about NOSAD, thinking about the efforts that you've had, and I know we've heard about you bringing in, you know, shared learning from other places, but when you think about organizations like NOSAD, how do you think that they too can actually help enable the spread of open source and the success of these kind of international or cross-border collaborations?
I think it's, I think we can provide in, again, knowledge sharing, but bringing it in from the international perspective. So I think one very good example is, for example, how the Dutch Association of Municipalities have collaborated or have talks with OS2, for example, about the Signalen project. Does that make sense for the Danish population? And we also have an examples between OS2 and their Swedish sister association, Sambruk, where the Swedish corresponding association are now evaluating, and I think also going active with at least one or two of the OS2 projects to see how they fit into the Swedish context. And I think also there is a good initiative here, for example, exemplified by OSPO++, in enabling code swapping and showcasing what others has done, for example, like Lutece or OpenDesk, and showing that some will be general enough, some will not, some are suitable for reuse internationally, some not. I mean, but then you also need to consider the generalizability of the software in the beginning, but also the internationalization. So we have Decidim here in the audience, and they are a very good example of really identifying a more general means of working that expands beyond a specific national context, and really working actively with the localization, with the translations and so on. So I think there are definitely good ways in how you can promote, and it's about bringing that knowledge in and showcasing it.
I love this because, again, this speaks to a little bit about how we can all work together, that when we do convene together and come together, perhaps it's not always about not to say that things like procurement isn't both important and sexy, but also there's this idea that if we actually get together to talk about our needs and to identify those common needs, we might also identify those areas that are worthwhile investing in terms of collaboratively kind of working together. And I want to also call out, just from my own perspective, the slide that you had up, which I loved, which had the kind of 4 elements of collaboration. So the idea, in Ireland, we have a phrase actually to refer to that. They call it the quadruple helix of innovation, which is about bringing together the public sector, academia, citizens, and the private sector, and how really through open source, we have an opportunity to bring all those parties to the table so that they can all share their needs, and then therefore nothing is assumed, and ultimately we get better citizen services, I guess. And I guess that's the goal. So thinking about the quadruple helix and bringing together everyone to the table. Georg, you're coming from the private sector. OSPOs in the private sector perhaps have been established there perhaps longer. Hearing what's happening with this movement in the public sector, are there lessons or is there advice that you would bring from your experience in the private sector that you think might again accelerate this effort in the public sector?
Yes. I'd like to really connect to what was said before, in the sense of we need to always keep an eye on the common needs, right? When I talk to my fellow colleagues in the company, I also like to point out that open source is very diverse. But in the private sector, where products are being built and sold, open source is primarily like this platform to build upon, right? And open source works best providing and jointly developing this common platform that can then be built on top of with, let's say, other stuff that is then use case or product specific. And I keep saying that because the open source ecosystem is also diverse, but we do see that besides the hobbyists project, the private sector is investing a lot in developing an open source software, but because they realize that this platform to build products on top of needs to be the best platform for them to build on top of. So they invest in terms of developers. It's actually companies investing in funding developers to develop this. And this needs to be also taken into account, I think, in the public sector. Just to be aware of that, just opening up code for the purpose of being open is, well, it's one thing, but what about sustainability? What's the business case around it? Well, I call it a business case. In the public sector domain, the business case is a public good business case, so to say. But how do we set up a framework that incentivizes investing in this? Because there's no such open source community out there that would magically pick up a project and make it work, right? It's at the end of the day, it comes down to money, right, and a business case, and that's kind of important. And in terms of collaboration, I also would like to point out it has been very beneficial to me to leverage our private sector OSPO networks, the To-Do Group, Swedish OSPO network, for instance, to share experiences, again, based on the same concept. We all use open source software to enable business, but it's not the core business itself. So it's fine to talk about how to go about it in the best possible ways. Again, coming together, solving common problems that everybody has jointly, but then building on top of that, right? Implementing it specifically in your organization then is kind of the logical next step. So this would be my recommendation to public sector OSPOs, keeping those two aspects in mind, the collaboration and trying to look at sustainability and the business case, so to say.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask now, because we may not come back for another time, but I know earlier we were also talking about this question of culture, and it has come up, you know, a lot in the various different discussions. So we had a brief conversation about this in the prep session for the panel discussion. So can you maybe comment on that, just in terms of how you have found that experience of getting people to change their mindset, to change culture? You know, is that something that you've been engaging in Ericsson, that you've seen great examples of that working places? How does that work? Any tips on that front?
Well, I do spend a lot of time actually on doing exactly that. I hope I'm somewhat successful, but it is also a journey, to be honest. So we started 3 years ago, and it will take probably another 3 years to kind of get everybody on the same page. But it's also a large organization. So yeah, cultural change. It starts with training, training to really help developers, but also managers and leaders, like you have different audiences, to understand what this is about. As a developer, how do you go about engaging with the community? So you want to get a bug fix in, how do I go about it, right? If you have never done it before, it might be scary, right? Managers, what does the strategy look like? How do I pick the building blocks for my product? Why do I need to dedicate some of my developers to contribute back? This is all very important. So that's the educational part. And on top of that, or besides it, it's very important for us as well, for me personally, to set up the right organizational structure, flows, processes, because you can have a perfectly educated workforce if the processes make it hard to contribute, for instance, nobody will do it. So right, it's basically both aspects that I need to work on.
Thank you. And I might add one more, because I think you've perfectly described this idea of, introducing clarity and making sure that it's easy to do it. And then I think one of the final ones that I've often heard talk about as well would be this idea of the motivation as well and rewarding people. And I think it's been mentioned here before about showcasing the great work that's happening. And in fact, I think the OSOR Awards are a great way of doing that and helping to showcase and make people proud of the work they've done. And I think that this is, again, another great opportunity that we can do together to actually make sure that everyone has more impact for the work that they do when they contribute to open source. Now there's an opportunity to do that beyond your city or your region or even your country. You can be contributing to something that's global. So Miguel, with that, may I come to you actually, because I know. Oh yeah, please feel free to comment.
In addition to the ideas expressed by Georg, something that we are doing at Commission, and that coming back to this cultural aspect, is the organization of internal hackathons. So we have development teams that we all know that they are busy with the releases, with high priority vulnerabilities that need to be fixed. They never find the time to fix those things in the backlog. And what we do is we put people together in one day, concentrating time, no distractions, and they get to solve those issues by working together that otherwise they could never have done. And we see them, we have done 2 already, and to break this or to bring this cultural aspect of collaboration, working together, finding the time to solve a specific issue together, share knowledge, those type of events is something I recommend as well to do this transformation and this education as well.
Brilliant, thank you. But I know that you also have been working not just as you mentioned before, not just internally with respect to the European Commission and things like the hackathon, which are fantastic, by the way, but you're also involved in this idea of the OSPO network, the European Commission and the European Union OSPO network. Can you maybe elaborate on what the European Commission is doing there?
Yeah. Indeed, coming back to the collaboration aspect, it's true, as you said, that we have more an internal dimension. We mainly, 90% of our work is more towards European Commission, but if we want to do our job right, we need to know what others are doing as well, so that we can learn from them, as it was mentioned, to try to address common challenges and share experiences. And actually, it was already in 2021, I think it was the city of Paris, they were proposing us, okay, we should do something so that we can work with others together to have this exchange of knowledge and practices. And so this is what we did. We started what we call the OSPO network. It's an informal network, let's say, with OSPOs from different member states. We started with Italy, France, Germany, the usual suspects, I would say, in the area of open source. And then little by little, it has been growing with more. And so far, it has given us the chance to, as I said, to share knowledge and identify common issues. But we now want to build a bit on top of that. What else can we do? And we met actually physically in Stockholm in this year in April, and we were saying, it was a proposal from Sweden actually, like, okay, how can we as OSPO network, deliver something tangible as well. Not only share, which is good already, it's an achievement, but what else could we do? And then we started with working with some initiatives that I don't know how far we will go, but for the moment, the discussions are there. One is what it was mentioned by Dillon before, the blue hats that was mentioned. So having like a collaborative effort on specific open source solutions from different member states, more globally, at global scale. And the other initiative is the code swap. So workshops, events where a specific solution is being presented to others. And then we try to identify these common needs that was mentioned before. So yeah, this is where we are right now.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that. So unfortunately, we started a little bit late, so we're running out of time. So we may move to the final question that I was hoping to ask you all. So we've heard some wonderful discussions today already, and I know there's more to come. But from your perspective, thinking about the organizations that you are part of, from what you've heard here, from what you've heard and seen here today, what do you think the future for collaboration on open technologies is in Europe? What would you like to see? If you could wave a magic wand and you could see one thing happen, what would you like to see? So Nils, I'll start with you.
As I mentioned before, I would love to see like 4 or 5 use cases where we really show as a European Union that we are really collaboratively pushing things forward and have really examples on which we learn together, maybe also fail to a certain degree, but have really the lessons learned in practice. So this would be my lesson number 1, or my point number 1. And then I would also go for the aspect that has been mentioned before and really talk about sustainability of solutions, really taking care that those solutions are being made available on the long run. And also, as also has been mentioned before, talking about business cases, because when you think about OpenDesk, for example, we have 8 open source vendors behind that project, and they are from different countries, having different interests. It's quite a challenge to get these aspects all together. So these are things where we really need to come up with sustainable business solutions and sustainable solutions for the public administration in the end.
Thank you, Nils. Nejia.
I want to insist on something. It was very, very interesting to hear from all of you this morning. We have a difficulty this day, this period, with our editors. I think that it's the same for my peers. And for example, the roadmap, we depend on their roadmap, we depend on their changing their business model, their changing of their costs. And what I would like to is a governance, a global governance at the national level, of course, but also at the European level and why not international level, to share our difficulties and how open source can help us to be more independent and to be responsible for our roadmap, our digital roadmap.
Thank you. Johan, what about you? Wave your magic wand.
Wave my magic wand, everything what they said, and probably what they will say as well. But well, I think one important thing is going beyond open source software and also going beyond open data and looking at the standards, the interfaces, and the hardware. I mean, taking openness as a construct, open innovation, if we use that kind of lens, and bringing that into everything digital, because it's a lot about, it's a lot of things that are policy-driven, top-down, but we need to bring the concept of openness into our ways of working and collaborating and sharing knowledge. I think that's a huge barrier, but also can provide a huge momentum going forward.
Create the big open tent, as it were, so thank you for that. Georg, what about you?
Yeah, as the private sector guy on the panel here, of course, I again need to re-emphasize the business or considerations that need to be taken into account in the context of open source. But on top of that, I think what I would like to see is also a very strong commitment to education, because that is, like, open source is a tool, right? And you can use a tool in a good or in a bad manner. And I think having funding that supports education at universities or reskilling, upskilling initiatives to basically spread the knowledge wider across Europe on how to work with open technologies, how the business case works, that will basically be most beneficial to all of us. So this is also something that I would like to see.
Thank you, education. Miguel, what about you?
Yeah, I comment a bit with Nils and Georg on the cases of success stories, business cases we need to promote. I think we need more visibility, and we have many catalogs in Europe that show these open source solutions, and we are working on a European one to give this visibility and this promotion. And maybe something that, just to add something that was not mentioned, I think that still the funding, the support, I really like from Mrs. Rea's presentation when she mentioned the EU Sovereign Tech Fund, the Sovereignty Fund, sorry. I think a bit of help in that respect is also needed. For instance, I was talking yesterday to the CDIM team, which is having a great success story. And, but they just, with a little bit more, I think their expansion would be much, much better. So it's not that much what they need. And I think this is something that needs to be considered as well for the future.
Thank you, Miguel. And I'm going to add one too, borrowing from the previous marvelous moderators ask for more time, not just for this panel. It would have been marvelous to have more time for this panel, but I think as well, just in general, across Europe, I'd love to be able to carve out the time in people's daily lives to learn more, because I think what we're hearing is open source makes sense for so many reasons, and just having their attention, getting time to have them be educated, to sort out the issues that we all have to work through to work better together. Hopefully we get to be that, have a place on their agenda to do that, because it just seems to make sense. So thank you all for your input here today. It's been a fabulous panel. So I want to say again, a huge thank you to Nils, Nejia, Johan, Georg, and Miguel. It's been fantastic. So please put your hands together. Thank you very much. All right, I didn't take your time.